and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 6 English lesson on relative pronouns and relative adverbs. All right. So if we do so once we are going to log in to aplusstudents.ca, and then we're going to select the subject. We're first going to log in with our username as well as our password. Once we've logged in with our username and our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 6. Once we have selected the subject of language arts, grade 6, then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of relative pronouns and relative adverbs. All right. So our subject, or not the subject, our chapter is relative pronouns and relative adverbs. It's adverbs. So our chapter is relative pronouns and relative adverbs. Our subject is English language arts, grade 6. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on is to identify relative pronouns and to use the relative pronouns such as who and whom. All right. So when it comes to a relative pronoun and a relative adverb, right? And then we say a relative pronoun introduces a dependent or relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And the five main relative pronouns, right, are words such as who, whom, whose, which, and that. So a relative pronoun introduces a dependent, which is also a relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And the five main relative pronouns are who, whom, whose, which, and that. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. And we said a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent clause, meaning that it is something that cannot stand on its own, that describes a noun or pronoun. And we made mention that the five relative pronouns are either who, whom, whose, which, and that. All right, so if we look at the example, right, it says the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. Mhm. So Peter, whom we met yesterday, has four younger brothers. So now we're going to basically have to, it says a relative pronoun introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. Right? So it says the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So which means that if we choose the relative pronoun, then it is who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So who lives next door? So who? So the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So who and her. Peter, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. So there we have relative clauses, which is who and whom. Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing braids. So there we have whose. And then it says, I just read Janet's new book, which came out last month. So this is the dress that I wore to my uncle's wedding. And we said, of course, a relative pronoun introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes who, that describes the noun, or describes the pronoun. And we use words such as who, whom, whose, which, and that. All right. All right. So when it comes to relative pronouns, right, we said it introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes a noun or describes a pronoun. And a relative pronoun who and give the relative pronoun who and whom, right? It gives more information about people. It says to figure out whether to use whom or who. So now we're going to have to figure out how do I or when do we use who and when do we use whom, right? So in order for us to figure out whether to use whom or who, we need to restate the independent clause with a personal pronoun. So here it says that in order for us to figure out how to use who or whom, right, we need to restate the dependent clause with a personal pronoun. For example, if the clause uses a subject pronoun, for example, he, she, or they, then we need to use the word who. So if we use either a subject such as he, she, or they, then only we use the word who. And if the clause uses an object pronoun such as him, her, or them, so we basically use who with the subject pronoun which is he, she, or they, and we use the word whom with an M with an object pronoun which is him, her, or they, them. For example, the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So even it says the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So basically, the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. And there we even have the word her. So she lives next door, right? And we say the relative pronoun, it releases or introduces a dependent or a relative clause that describes a noun or nouns. All right. And we say that we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. And our first lesson on aplusstudents.ca is to identify relative pronouns. So it says a relative pronoun introduces a dependent or relative clause that describes a noun or pronoun. And we say that the five main relative pronouns are who, whom, whose, which, and that. And if we look at a few sentences or examples, right, it says, The woman who lives next door. So we say that we use the main relative pronouns such as who, whom, whose, which, and that. So if we look at the examples, it says the man who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. So the woman who lives next door grows tomatoes in her garden. Right? So which means that who lives next door is our answer. So which means that who lives next door is underlined. Right? And who goes also with her garden, her over there. And then Peter, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. This is not how we use the word whom. Then if you look at the third one, it says Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing a braid. Right? And the words in bold, right? That is are the relative pronouns or the main pronouns, right? And the words in bold will basically tell us also. Remember, we said it's a dependent clause. It depends on, let's say, the independent clause within a specific sentence, right? So these are relative pronouns. Example, if we use the word who lives next door, for example, then we can, for example, just say it is the granny, grandparents. All right. And then if you look at the word whose, right? Emily, whose hair is quite long, likes wearing braids. All right, let's look at one sentence before we go on to our test. It says, we took a ferry to Ellis Island, which is popular tourist spot. All right. So we took a ferry to Ellis Island, which is popular tourist spot. So we need to select the relative pronoun. So we took the ferry to Ellis Island, which, or we can say which is a popular tourist spot. Right? So that is our relative pronoun, which is our dependent or relative clause. So we then have to choose the word which, right? And it basically is the start of a dependent clause. So which is our relative pronoun. All right. So now we're going on to our test, where we're going to identify relative pronouns. So we're now going to identify the relative pronouns, right? It says select the relative pronoun. I'm not familiar with the role that Rosa suggested. So we need to say, is she either looking at, or is our relative pronoun either with or that? So I'm not familiar with the role, with the route that Rosa suggested. Is it a route or route? We need to say, is it with or that? We need to select the relative pronoun. Let's go with the I'm not familiar with the route or the route that Rosa suggested. All right, let's choose the second one then. And the second one is correct. It's the start of a dependent clause. Well done. We need to select the relative pronoun. So we need to select the relative pronoun. It says, we are planning a special celebration for Dalton, who turns 30 next week. Is it for or who? That is our relative pronoun. So we are planning a special celebration for Dalton, who turns 30 next week. Is it for or who? And if we choose the correct pronoun, relative pronoun, we will say who is our pronoun. So who is correct? We need to select the relative pronoun. Miss Clark is a lawyer who specializes in labor law. So Miss Clark is a lawyer who specializes in labor law. So we're going to say, let's go with who. Or do we say in? Who is correct? Well done. All right, so it says Leon has an excellent memory, which serves him well on tests. Is it which or him? So Leon has an excellent memory, which serves him well on tests. So is it which or him? Which is a dependent clause. So Leon has an excellent memory, which serves him well on tests. Let's go with which serves him well on tests, and which is correct. All right. So are you happy with the people who we selected? So we need to choose either whom or the. So are you happy with the people whom we elected? So if we choose the relative pronoun, let's go with whom we elected. And whom is correct. And then the next one, we need to select the relative pronoun. Brad, who loves to experiment with new flavors, took cooking classes in Thailand. So we will say Brad, who loves to experiment with new flavors, took cooking classes in Thailand. All right, let's go with who. So who or loves. And who is our relative pronoun, right? Now we're going to use our relative pronouns, which is whom and who. So it's going to be who and whom. So we see the relative pronoun introduces a dependent clause that describes a noun or describes a pronoun. And a relative pronoun, which is who and whom, gives information about people. So basically, to find out or to figure out whether to use who or whom, we need to restate the dependent clause with a personal pronoun. So to find out whether to use who or whom, all right. For example, if we use the words who and whom, right? Then it says to figure out whether to use who or whom, restate the dependent clause with a personal pronoun. So you need to assume that you are in that thing. If the clause uses a subject, then you use with. And if the clause uses an object name, we use him, her, them. So we use who when we use words like he, she, they, and whom when they're using words like him, her, or them. So we need to choose the correct relative pronoun. All right. So basically, the man who lives Next door grows tomatoes in his garden. So basically, if we look at the sentence, right? All right. So we say that a relative pronoun, it introduces a dependent clause. And remember, a dependent clause, it depends on an independent clause, right? And we said we use the word who if the clause uses a subject pronoun such as he, she, or they. And we use the word whom if the clause uses an object pronoun such as him, her, or they. Example, Peter, whom you met yesterday, has four younger brothers. And if we rewrite that sentence, it can basically just be you met him yesterday. All right. Now let's go to our test. So we're going to basically begin the test and we're going to use the relative pronouns who and whom and choose the correct one. So the Olympics drivers, do we say whom represent the United States will likely earn medals, or do we say the Olympic tribes who represent the United States will likely earn medals? And if we choose the correct one, and then we're going to say the Olympics driver who represent the United States will likely earn medals. And who is the correct one? So we said who. So well done. Who is correct? Brooke wanted a kayaking instructor. Do we say who had plenty of experiences working with beginners or whom had plenty of experience working with beginners? Brooke wanted a kayaking instructor. Do we say who Had plenty of experience working with beginners, or whom had. So we will go with who had. So who had plenty of experience working with beginners. So Stephen Patton is the person. Do we say whom decorates the auditorium before every concert, or who decorates the auditorium before every concert? So we need to choose between who decorates it or whom decorates it. The Steve Patton is the best. So Stephen Patton is the person who decorates the auditorium before every concert. And who is great? And we need to complete the sentence with the base relative pronoun, which says, will the volunteer whom we contacted be creating the flyers? Or will the volunteer who we contacted be creating the flyers? Let's quickly see what the first one. And whom is correct, right? So basically, when it comes to relative pronouns, right, we're just going to have to know when to write who and when to write whom. And Elena considers Kimberly. Do we say who she knows since kindergarten, the perfect companion, or whom she knows? Let's go with who she knows. Oh, it's actually whom she knows since kindergarten. All right. So this is now the end of our lesson on relative pronouns and relative adverbs, right? We specifically focus on identifying relative pronouns using who and whom. Right? So if we use even the pronouns who and whom, right? We use who for he, she, and it, and we use whom for like when it shows a plural form. All right, so that is the end of our lesson on relative pronoun and adverb. Thank you very much for joining the class, and you should have a good day further. Goodbye.